Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar today, not in person, but we're very happy to have you virtually. This is Animal Health Week, and this is our inaugural webinar today. So today we have Dr. David Waltner-Toews, who's an epidemiologist, an essayist, a poet, a fiction writer. He has written textbooks, a multitude of peer-reviewed papers, and published books in poetry, short stories, and fiction. He has also published multiple books on looking at the complexity of diseases and our human-animal ecosystem, on our ecosystem interface. He is a graduate of the University of Saskatchewan, where he did his DVM, and the University of Guelph, where he did his PhD. Dr. David Waltner-Toews is a university professor emeritus at the University of Guelph in the Department of Population Medicine. He was founding president of Vets Without Borders, Vétérinaires Sans Frontières, and a founding member of Communities of Practice for Ecosystem Approaches to Health in Canada and internationally. He has worked on every continent except Antarctica on ecosystem approaches to health. In 2010, in London, England, the International Association of Ecology and Health presented him with the Inaugural Award for contributions to ecosystem approaches to health. And in 2019, he received an award for this World Small Animal Veterinary Association here in Toronto, recognizing veterinarians who have exhibited exceptional acts of valor and commitment in the face of adversity to service the community. Dr. David Waltner-Toews has been a dear friend of mine, and I can easily say he is the most important mentor of my veterinary career. He was my professor, and I was a proud co-member and founder of Vets Without Borders. He is an exceptional person, and I am very excited to hear what he has to say today. I will quickly just mention the program sponsors today. We have the Program Plus sponsors for Animal Health Week, which are IDEXX and Merck Animal Health. And we also have PetCard, iFinance, Verbac, and Pet Secure.
Thanks, Enid, for that somewhat embarrassing introduction, but you're amazing. CVMA couldn't have a better leader during this time. Somebody who can dance really well, you know, around changing situations. I want to take a somewhat different approach to the pandemic than probably many of you have heard. I should probably say that I'm in Kitchener, Waterloo, Ontario, and I'm living on land that's the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and Neutral people. And I'm grateful to be able to live on this land. So the picture on the right there is from a Canadian painter, Robert Gonzalez, whom I love very much, and it's in a sense about unexpected consequences. We think we're playing with a toy train, and then a real train comes around the corner, and the pandemic is a little bit like that. Oh, now I have to, there we go. I want to say some things that they're about the pandemic that are both good and bad. So the most frustrating things about this pandemic is it's caused by a zoonotic agent, and all indications are that you can't eradicate pandemic diseases that are of zoonotic origin. There might be a few exceptions, but that's the general rule. It's shattered our fantasies about our complete control of nature, and it's undermined, therefore, a lot of our things that we thought of as scientific certainties. And you see that the way it's presented in the news. And actually, it's lasting long enough to destroy probably the most successful global economy in the world's history. How can I do this? There we go. Okay. I have to use my mouse. If I press return, it doesn't work, Enid. So the best things about this pandemic are it's caused by a zoonotic agent, and thus requires us to rethink our relationship with nature. So it's a bad thing and it's a good thing. And for vets, it's actually a good thing because that means animals are really important in going forward. It shattered our fantasies about complete control, and so we have to rethink how we do this whole interaction with nature and science and how we learn things. And it's lasting long enough for us to have time to think about what can we do next? How do we do next? The SARS one that came through, it happened so fast that the disease was, there were pathognomonic signs, you could recognize it, you could isolate people, and we got rid of it. This one's lasting long enough to actually push us to ask some broader, more serious questions. In a lot of the presentations you hear, a lot of it's about the virus. And I try to keep up on this. There's a good series out of MIT. It's actually an undergrad course that they're teaching, and they have some of the best virologists in the world. So I'm learning a lot about virology, and I'm not a virologist, but we need to know about these things. But it's not just about that. And certainly as veterinarians, we know it's also about hosts and reservoirs. Oh, come on, forward. There we go. So it's about how we interact with and share what we would now call microbiomes of other animals. And when I went through vet school, and in fact, when I was teaching at vet school, that we didn't have microbiomes. They didn't exist, right? Suddenly, there's a whole lot of research on that. All of the bacteria and viruses and fungi and so on that live in and around various animals and ourselves and the landscapes we live in. So we have, people interacting with farm animals, and we have BSE and E. coli and cowpox and rabies, TB. There's a whole list of diseases, and we can separate them out according to the species from which they were the original reservoirs. And that's basically the way I learned it and the way I tended to teach it. So it was, we got dogs, this is what we get from dogs. We got cows, this is what we get from cows. My understanding of this is changing partly because the world is changing. So how do they get from the animals to us in a traditional sense? Well, there's a direct route. We either bite them, i.e. we eat them, or they bite us, things like rabies. There's some obvious transmission ways there. I'm not going to spend any time on well, I will talk a little bit about foodborne. But so there's this direct. There are the arthropod-borne ones, and the point here is not that you look at the cycle so much, but to recognize that, okay, that with West Nile virus, that there are birds and mosquitoes, and then they end up coming to dead-end hosts like us or horses. If we look at Lyme disease, it's more complicated. We have deer, we have ticks, we have field mice, we have people, perhaps dogs. So we have this, this much more complex web, but without the arthropods, without the ticks, which are actually arachnids, that cycle would fall apart. It depends on those being there. But we're pushing into the next phase already, which is a shared environment. And I mean, the one in the upper left there, that's animal slaughtering on the banks of the Bishnumadi River in Kathmandu. So we have high data disease, which is what I was working on. On the right-hand top, we have animal visitation programs. One might ask questions about a dog in an ICU, but those are the kind of things that we would have recognized as veterinarians. And then, of course, there's the home life and recent outbreaks of salmonella with pig ear treats and things like that, which seems to be a recurring theme. So we have those shared environments. But for something to be a pandemic, it's not enough for it to get to people. We have to be able to pass it on to other people. And in general, what we've seen is that many of those are viruses, partly because viruses they're less stable, let's say, than bacteria and other agents. They pick up genetic material. If they come from, like influenza, comes from water birds, that's the original reservoir, and then it might get into pigs, and then it gets into people. If they come directly to people, they don't adapt quite as well. So for instance, avian influenza, H1N1, people can get infected, but because the receptors are further down in the lung, it's harder to get infected. It's worse if you get it because it's deeper down in the lung, but it tends not to, it hasn't become a pandemic, and it's made it easier for us on the veterinary side to control it. So it's got to get, and it kind of looks a little bit like that. That's Hieronymus Bosch garden of earthly delights, and we won't dwell on that in particular. The theme I'm coming at this with is basically One Health. Now, I came out of a background in this whole field. There are all these integrated approaches. We initially talked about ecosystem health and ecosystem integrity, and there are different research backgrounds, conservation medicine, which came out of Tufts Veterinary School. And then there was a shift towards ecosystem approaches to health. So if we can't define exactly what an ecosystem is, maybe we can look at looking at health issues in terms of their ecological relationships. And that was reduced down to eco-health. There are also people who looked at sustainable livelihoods, which is coming at it from how people make a living in this complex interaction. And then most recently, One Health. I just wanted to put those up there to kind of remind ourselves that One Health is a way of reframing what's been happening over many decades now. And if you look at that, it maybe becomes a little bit like that Hieronymus Bosch picture. One way to come at this, another way to come at this big mess, which is very difficult to get a handle on, is to look at narratives and to look at stories. So these systemic approaches often default to fixed boundaries. And we might think of this as veterinarians as a clinical exam, the health of the animal, the health of the farm. That's harder to do with an ecosystem. Where's the boundary? Because you have things coming in and out, and especially now with a pandemic. So the result may look like a Hieronymus Bosch painting, or my students, it's not a painting, it's a painting, misspelling. Or one of the spaghetti diagrams that my students have seen me draw, where you look at it and you go, what do we do with this information? Everything's connected. But they do give, if we look at a clinical exam, if you want, we look at this system. What narratives do is they give us a history. So if you're a veterinarian, you get a history, right? You not only do a clinical exam, you say, well, how did this animal or this farm get to this point? One of the ways to look at this is to look at what have been theorized, and there's good evidence for this, that bats are the reservoir for this particular coronavirus. So bats are 20 to 25% of mammal species. And a lot of people don't realize that. It's closer to 25% in the Americas. It's maybe 20% worldwide. And they've got multiple roles throughout the world. They scatter seeds, they pollinate, they eat insects. But if they're the reservoir, how did it get from bats into people? And one of the reasons they think a bat is a reservoir is because this coronavirus is apparently 96% similar to coronaviruses that they found in fruit bats. Remind ourselves that we're 96% similar to chimpanzees. It doesn't mean we're the same. We're apparently 90% similar to Abyssinian cats. And so that, there is some uncertainty in this, but let's assume that that's the case. How would it get from a bat to a person? These are some of the intermediate animals that have been suggested. That some have suggested that it went directly into people, because in South China, there's evidence of serological exposure to various coronaviruses over time. People living near bat caves, people interacting with bats in various ways, and that there's been a kind of low-level infection there. But other ways of transmission are through these pangolins, the scaly anteaters, raccoon dogs, which are raised for their fur and hunted for their fur. The pangolins are treated or traded for supposedly their medicinal value. So there's an illegal wildlife trade there. Snakes were suggested at one point, cane rats, which are both pests and delicacies. And as I said, people have also been suggested as being not an intermediary, but that has been floating around in people for a while. Each one of those has a different story. So you've got all these dots, if you want, and how do you connect one to the other? Do we have other examples, if you want, of bat to human transmissions? Another one that's still in the news is Ebola virus. In the initial big outbreak was in Liberia and Republic of Guinea. In the 1990s and early 2000s, there was violence, there was war. That was immediately followed by billions of dollars in mining investments over the next decade, and more than half of Liberia's forests were sold off to industrial loggers after the war. And that was immediately followed by the outbreak with 29,000 people sick with Ebola, 11,000 dead. And then more recently in Democratic Republic of Congo, which is further east, 2,300 people dead in DRC near Virunga Park, which some people will recognize as being a guerrilla sanctuary. There's also rebel fighting there, and the DRC government has talked about opening up to oil exploration because they want to generate money in the country. So we have what happened there was you have this disruption, you have war, you have industrial development, deforestation, people moving into new areas, interacting with wildlife in different ways, eating bushmeat, sometimes directly eating bats that are sick, sometimes eating animals that have been made sick by bats. And why do people eat bushmeat? Partly it's dislocation. You're in a new place. You don't have access to your regular sources of food. You've been dislocated by war and industrial development. And partly because people develop a taste for it. It's like people here eating eating venison and other wildlife. People prefer certain kinds of food. So it's a mixture of things there. The other example is the situation on which the movie Contagion was based, and that is to say, we had a bunch of pigs getting sick and dying in Malaysia, and then people getting sick and dying. And when we went back and looked at that situation, what happened there was Singapore wanted to keep their city clean. They offloaded their agriculture to neighboring countries, Malaysia and Indonesia. So pigs were being raised within these Muslim countries basically for our export into Singapore. About the same time, a combination of climate change and forestry clearance through forest fires, some of it for growing palm oil, which was supposedly supposed to be better than using fossil fuels, but it has its own issues. And if you looked at the satellite images in the late 1990s, there were clouds of smoke all over Southeast Asia. And the fruit bats, who were normally flying in that area, they had the migration routes, they were looking for fruit trees to feed on. What they did was they found mango trees planted next to the pig farms. And from an ecological point of view, you say, great, outdoor, the pigs are going outside, there's fruit trees around, it's all green. But this interaction with the climate change and the deforestation, the fruit bats were eating the mangoes, they were pooping into the pig pens. The pigs were picking up this virus from the bats, and you had a lot of people and pigs getting sick and dying. So that's another way that these viruses can get from bats into people. So it's a little bit more complex than this direct eating or trading with bats. And here's another way that, as veterinarians, we think about this. So it's, especially if you work in agriculture, if we go back to 1600 in France, throw your mind back that far, this saying that, if God keeps me, I will make sure that no peasant in my realm will lack the means to have a chicken in the pot on Sunday. Turns out the Lord didn't keep him. He was assassinated about a year later by a fanatical Catholic who didn't think he was sincere enough, so you have ideology thrown in there. But about the same time, we have René Descartes, who was basically one of the founding parents of what we think of as modern science. And what he said was, for by these scientific principles, I perceived it to be possible to render ourselves the lords and possessors of nature. And he also went on to say, why would we want to do this? And he said, for the health of people. So that became ingrained in the way we do science. And it's the kind of science which I would call thing-based. It's we're really good at studying stuff, viruses, animals, trees, plants. We're really terrible at studying relationships, which is really where we've gotten into trouble now. So we got a chicken or a pig in every pot if we look at from the 1960s till now, and that's largely based on advances in that basic kind of science. The development of antibiotics in poultry, it's being able to identify vitamins and synthesize vitamin D so the chickens could be moved inside rather than requiring free range to get their vitamin D. A whole range of what I would call thing-based science. If I can go ahead here, come on. We can do this. There we go. So how did this happen? Well, what we did was we went from previously, where we have in the top picture, we have the farmer, the butcher, and the animal rights activist all in the same picture, right? It's, at the bottom, this is another project I was involved in. It's outside a bar in Pucallpa, Peru. So the food was very close by. Everybody could see what was going on. After this massive success, you don't see any people in there anymore, right? It's all computer controlled. They're all inside barns. If somebody goes in, you put on a hazmat suit, you check on what's going on, you monitor it by computers. So we made this shift. We got a chicken in every pot, and there have been some unexpected consequences of that. The other thing that's happened since the 1960s, and this is particularly since the 1990s, we kind of took this industrial model and we said, okay, we do have economies of scale. The other thing we need to do is specialize. So instead of specializing in one place, let's look at different parts of the world where they're better at growing avocados or other kinds of plants, and then bring those together somewhere. So we've got, this is actually, Enid will recognize it's even worse than my spaghetti model. So this is a mathematically generated diagram of international food trade networks. And they studied this and they looked at this, and then you look at this and you go, I don't know how to make sense out of this. The idea was if we specialize, we trade, the money will be generated and we'll all make more money, right? Well, not everybody made more money. On average, in fact, the world economy improved. On average, people's life expectancy improved. People were generally healthier, and you will see people who paint a very rosy picture of what's happened in the last 50 years. And you can tell that story, and if you drill down, however, you end up with all kinds of the devil is in the details, literally. Another thing that happened during this time, an unexpected consequence, was the avian influenza, which never became pandemic. It's a zoonotic disease directly transmitted to people, hard to transmit. People get it, usually people that work directly with the chickens, and then they die. In 2020, this year, there were outbreaks of avian influenza just south of Wuhan, and 20,000 chickens were culled. So we have, this is happening sort of just when this pandemic is emerging. The other narrative that I'm bringing in here is that is African swine fever, which seems an odd thing to bring in here, which came out of, long story short, the Italians invaded Africa. They brought rinderpest with them. It killed off 90% of the ungulates in sub-Saharan Africa. The settlers imported the domestic pigs from Europe, and there had been this natural cycle of the African swine fever virus going around between wild pigs and soft-bodied ticks. And it didn't bother those pigs so much, but the domestic pigs had killed them off quite dramatically, and there were major outbreaks in Africa, in Europe, and usually stopped by what we call stamping out. No vaccine for this disease. In early 2020 or 2018, this virus got into China. Some people say it came from Russia, they deny it. Some people say it came from Europe, they deny it. There are different background stories to this. The bottom line is it got into China. within a year and a half, 2 years, half the pigs in China, 200 million pigs, which was a quarter of the pigs in all the world, were died from the disease or were killed to stamp out the disease. So then we have the other part of this puzzle, if you want. We have these wet markets. The thing about wet markets is people say, well, we should shut them down. But wet markets are really, for those of us that have been in that part of the world, we all say we should have fresh food. And I've given lectures on this. Fresh food is better, right? You're not going to generate foodborne diseases as much. If you're in an area where you don't have refrigeration, or it's not very common, then how do you get fresh food? The farmers bring the animals to the market and they kill them there. If they kill them at home and bring them to the market and they don't sell them, it's a big loss to them. So in terms of the farmer's risk, it's better to bring the live animals there. There's a kind of subculture of wildlife trade, but it's often in the background, a little bit black market, underground. Some of it's above ground. So like you go to a market here and you can buy venison and emu and various other llama and various other kinds of meats, which are kind of marginal and they're not usually wildlife trade. You find wild boar. So then this is all happening. We have the African swine fever and we have the drop in pig production. We have the drop in poultry production because of avian influenza. And then we're coming up end of January, beginning of February, Chinese year of the white metal rat is coming up. I kind of like this because I'm born in the year of the rat. Theoretically, I kind of like rats. I mean, it's, in real life, there's some issues. But I like the way this one Chinese horoscope site said, let's see how this rat year will work out for you, right? We really had no idea. What happened was all of these things converged. Tens of millions of people coming into Wuhan to this, looking for fresh food, looking for fresh meat, to have this big celebration. And there were fewer pigs, there were fewer chickens. So what do the guys in the market do, the people in the market? They say, well, we've got these other animals over here, sort of in a back corner. Maybe you would like some of that. So we've got, in a sense, this perfect storm of things coming together, all of these different strands. The temptation, and I would call this a Babel temptation, or the Descartes would have said, you know, we want one language, scientific language that's going to, everybody's going to agree on this and we're all going to find the solution to our problems. The problem is if we declare that there's one story. If you look at this, there are stories of traders, there are stories of agriculture. Some of them are positive, some of them have negative consequences, interaction with wildlife. This is a modern version of this. Julie Holcomb is a photographer in the US. She does these wonderful collages, if you want. The other way to look at it is to use Douglas Adams, you know, a Babelfish. Instead of having one story, there are many stories. If we look at farmers, if we look at traders in Africa, if we look at poor peasants in one part of the world, if we look at corporate agriculture, pet owners, how we interact with wildlife. We've been telling people for years, you should go out, you should get outside, get lots of exercise, but that also encroaches on wildlife. And so we've got all of these interactions. How do we begin to put them together? So if we look at this from a veterinary point of view, for individual animals and herds, the diagnostic and clinical and treatment decisions are made by a vet together with a client. There are some judgment calls and then we follow up. We say, well, it's probably this. We can do some further tests, but let's try this out. We use lots of different kinds of sources of information, lab information, exam, histories, and we get a pretty good idea about the quality of that information, you know, depending on who the client is and what the labs are. For pandemics like this, the diagnostics and response decisions involve multiple professionals and multiple owners, and that's where the challenge is. The quality and reliability of the information from those sources is much more difficult to assess. So we get people filling in the gaps with kind of, maybe there's data, maybe there isn't. You all get all kinds of conspiracy theories. And the clinical judgments by different owners in this system are going to be different. And we see this certainly at a political level, but it comes down to within our society. People say, well, we're trading off this for that. We would rather have this outcome versus that outcome. It means a different kind of care. So we need to ask some different questions than we would in a simple clinical setting. We need to ask, what are the boundaries of the system here? If you got a dog or a cow or a farm even, you have some sense of the boundaries. Who's the owner? There are multiple owners. Whose health are we promoting? Whose story is this? And I have 3 pictures there of avian influenza, these 3 here. The one on the top right that was in a market in Thailand when avian influenza was at its height. And the woman was selling both free running birds, if you want, and commercial birds. And WHO was trying to get everybody to go commercial. And this woman was saying, well, I think it was 10 times as much on a per kilogram basis for the free running birds as I do for the commercial birds. So there's an economic incentive to go the other way. The lower left there I was at an area in Indonesia where a village in the middle of an area where there's lots of avian influenza. And they said in this village, we don't have any avian influenza. So we went to visit and ran a little workshop there. And we said, do you have any sick birds? And they said, yeah, what do you do with them? Well, we throw them out the back in the river. Okay. Can we look at your birds? So we went and looked at the birds, and they have competitive singing roosters. They sound like Caesarea Avora with this, lounge singing, wonderful voices. They're worth $2,000 or $3,000 US, which is a huge amount of money for these poor farmers. Of course, they're not going to get bird flu, because if they get declared to having bird flu in their village, the authorities come in, they kill all the birds, and they pay them market compensation. That doesn't cut it. So we have this kind of diversity. And I was really struck at a workshop in Argentina where we were working on links between health and ecology on the eastern slopes of the Andes, which are called the Yungas. And we had vets, we had doctors, we had ecologists, a whole range of people, indigenous leaders, and we're arguing about, running water and toilets and food preparation, all of these kind of things to promote human health, and protected areas for wildlife and counting species for biodiversity. And one of the indigenous leaders said, this is really about land rights. If we conserve the land as indigenous people, then we conserve all of these things and we can generate better health for everybody, including all of the animals. And there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of disagreement, as you can imagine. And one of the indigenous leaders from Peru, she said, when we get to a certain point in these kinds of negotiations, we just kill the other people. And I'm going, okay, we're having this great academic research workshop. But what it told me was, this is really important stuff. This is life and death. And that's what we're dealing with here. And it's not that one story's right and the other one's wrong. We have to negotiate our way through this. So what that means is that our scientific and technological success has relied on basically single vision. You focus in on the virus, you focus in on the dog, you focus in on this or that or the other thing. We're really good at that. We can't see everything around us. And if individuals that lose their peripheral vision start stumbling around because they don't see what's happening around them. So as a group, as a society, we need to find ways to collaborate across disciplines and organizations, or we're always going to be blindsided. So we become each other's peripheral visions. And that's where the underlying ideas of One Health and EcoHealth come in. Vets talking to doctors, talking to people in the street, talking to clients, talking to farmers, talking to a whole range of different people to try to get a sense as to what's going on around you. Doesn't mean you have to know everything. I don't, know everything about the virology, and I don't know, the economics of how this works, but I try to pay attention to what other people are doing and what are the implications for what I'm doing here. And to me, that's where, as veterinarians, we need to move ahead. It's not that we change our focus on the health of the animals or the farms, it's that we pay more attention to what other people, other professions are doing around us. The quote at the bottom there from Emily H. Dorr, she is an anthropologist who worked on the idea that eating insects was going to save the world. And I wrote a whole book on that, and I'm trying to explore it. And the thing is, each part of the world, it's different, right? And her push was that we needed to look at the role of insects in different parts of the world. There are, in a sense, different worlds. And the quote from the poet Pablo Neruda from Chile, that all life is not outward, nor is all death from within. And the point being there is that, as we are discovering, people don't just live in order to avoid getting sick or dying. They live to be with their friends, to be with their families, to be out in nature. How do we begin to balance the inner life and the outer life, the mental well-being of people and the well-being of nature? And at that point, I'm going to quit screen sharing, and we can, I don't know if there are any questions or discussion. I think I've left enough time.
Thank you, David. That was a really fascinating webinar. I'll leave, see if anybody brings in some chats. I think in questions, it's always so incredible to see how, and I've seen that spaghetti model you've done, so that it's, you know, we are so inextricably linked to everything. And I recently spoke to a parasitologist who I interviewed, and I think he really talked about, you know, when we're talking about being part of One Health, really we should be just thinking of ourselves as being part of our ecosystem. And that is exactly how you've always thought of it, that way, as, you know, even though we are working all together, we are all part of this. And I really appreciate you bringing that in, especially with the pandemic that we're all living through right now. It's good to hear the reality of the historical aspects as well of human health, animal health, and our environment.
Well, that indicates that our decisions actually have longer term consequences because of the way these things are tied up. And we're learning as we go along.
Right.
And I think, as you know, as my students have informed me, these kinds of diagrams can be paralyzing. You look at it, we're related to everything else. What do we do? Yeah. And I think what it underlines is that we can't do everything, but other people are learning other kinds of things. And if we can find ways to share information across disciplines, across cultures, then we're going to be further ahead and be better able to anticipate where the next pandemic might come from. I look at, you know, what's happened with Ebola virus, and I say, well, some of these things have to do with encroaching on wildlife areas. And do we have any parts of our political boundaries where we have industries wanting to encroach on conservation areas? Well, I can't think of any areas. That might be a place to look, because it increases our interaction with species with whom we don't have a long-standing understanding and interchange of microbiomes, if you
want. I had a question. So what is your view about why the veterinary profession has been so understated in this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this tends to happen. I think one of the reasons, the big reasons, is because we're focused on the emergency among people. Once it gets into people, then we pay less attention to the origins of where it came from. And I think that's quite right. I mean, once it's pandemic, you want to know, how can we stop this? How do we put the fire out in the barn before we figure out how to build a better barn? I think we can try to do these things at the same time. And I think in the longer term, veterinarians have a much stronger role, because we're trying to find ways to prevent these things from occurring in the future. So it's, you know, we're well placed to look at, as this pandemic lasts and we're figuring out, you know, the techniques of what works. Can we develop a vaccine? What are the practices of, you know, isolation, quarantine, masks? Which are the things that work, and so on? How does the virus behave among people? That's all really important right now. And quite rightly, that's what the political leaders are focusing on. As we look forward, then we say, okay, this happened because of certain kind of interactions between people and animals. What kind of interactions were they? How can we manage them in the future so that we're less likely to run into something like this? So I think it's reasonable. I mean, I've got a daughter and a daughter-in-law who are both physicians, and they're focused on people, right? They're not looking at dogs and cats and pigs and chickens and things like that.
So I have a couple more questions coming in. One is fairly broad, so I'll let you bite into this one. It is a question of how do you think we could implement One Health in Ontario, which may be the same question as everywhere in Canada, but.
Well, yeah, the second one there, I was all there, or the one there's somebody asks about going to a more vegetable to vegetarian diet, and I've heard that before, and I think it's very important that we reduce reliance on meat sources. But I have to say that, and Enid would, I think, concur with this. We've been in parts of the world. I know I have one of my colleagues who worked in Rwanda after the genocide, and she said, you know, one of the big shortages there was a shortage of cow manure, because that's what they relied on for fertilizer to hold the soil in place so that they could grow their crops, and using the cattle for labor. So if you don't have that, what do? You import fossil fuel-based fertilizers. Is that going to be an improvement? I don't think so. So we could argue for, you know, ecologically based agriculture, which would include animals. I mean, I think of growing up in the prairies where farmers who are primarily crop farmers might have a dry lot for some cows, where they would, to whom they would feed crops that would otherwise rot in the field, you know, if it was too wet to harvest and those kinds of things. So it became part of that ecosystem. I think the process of industrialization in agriculture, the giant feedlots, the giant slaughterhouses, has created some serious problems for us. And I'm not saying we go back to subsistence farming, but I think there's a more reasonable way to deal with this in the middle. How do we work with One Health in Ontario? I mean, I think it's keeping these discussions going across medical health boundaries. We found in the vet school that the collaboration between the vet school and the medical school, we worked with Western primarily, it was a problem because of this thing that vets are focused on clinical treatment of animals, and the medical students are focused on people. They were interested in avian influenza if it comes through the door of the hospital. And we were trying to say, well, why don't we look out in this, you know, do swabbing ducks and things like that. It might be better if there were collaboration with, if we want public health people. And I think there is some of that happening already. People outside of the hospital setting. It's a challenge because we've got, you know, it's been at least a century of this kind of compartmentalization. I think it's, like I said, one of the good things about this pandemic is that we're having time to think about some of these things in Ontario and nationally. And I would say, looking, you know, if we're trying to put this into place, you want to have broad policy, like national policies for guidance and so on. But ultimately, the decisions have to be made more locally because you know, either in a clinic or usually in a community, because the access to food, the access to resources tends to be local. The reason you want a national policy is so you can move resources around, and that can be a challenge in Canada where you've got, you know, for vets and doctors, you got to be relicensed in each province, and that's a challenge. We should be able to move resources to different areas where they're most needed. So we're more deft, more agile, because that's the kind of health system we're going to need in the future, rather than we've got a bigger hospital with more beds. It's more, we've got more medium-sized hospitals, we've got resources we can move around, we've got shorter supply chains for some of the things we need in that system.
David, I'm going to take a second and read some of the comments and questions that have come up, because I think that it's interesting to see what people's thoughts are on this area, and particularly in part about plant-based diets, et cetera. So one of the comments was, I think it's interesting to see how our changes in societal values started to change the risks. I don't know if the risk is increasing, but it's certainly changing. The movement towards hobby farms has increased the proximity between families and livestock. The movement towards organic increases outdoor production and exposes livestock to the environment. These are already leading to different challenges. You can see, it was just like, as we were saying, how I think there's so many options out there as to the way that we can see forward, but that they all are inextricably linked in the end anyway. Another comment, it's not really a question, as she said, it's amusing. Many of these pandemics arise because of the unnatural and often horrific ways human beings interact with non-human animals. And I always wonder why it is not the focus for One Health. Why is it not the goal worldwide? I'm wondering if you have a comment on that, David.
I guess, and you would know this from Vets Without Borders, Enid, I'm wary of particularly white North Americans coming up with the answer to everybody else's problems. If we went this way, it would solve the problem, or we only went that way. They tend to, working with other people in the places where they live and trying to find sustainable solutions. In some places that I've been, people are primarily vegan or vegetarian. They have their own issues around that. Some of those were long-term cultural changes. I think many of the problems we've run into with regard to, for instance, getting a chicken in every pot have been, you want to keep the price down so that poor people can afford it. Well, the way we've done that is economies of scale and global trade. And that's put huge environmental pressures, animal welfare problems, all kinds of things around that. And another way to look at that is say, well, can we integrate the actual cost of sustainable production into agricultural systems, keep it local, maybe like Michael Pollan has said, eat real food, that's to say food you can recognize, mostly plants, not too much. I mean, it's a good basic guideline going down that road. And then if poor people can't afford that, then maybe the solution is not in agriculture to go to mass production and global trade, but to turn around and say, well, maybe we need a guaranteed annual income. I mean, we've got people like Hugh Seagull, who's a dyed-in-the-wool red Tory, conservative, saying we need to have this in order that people can afford to buy a chicken once a week and put it in a pot. So, and I don't know enough about economics to say that that's the solution, but I look at that and I say it takes the pressure off the animal side of things and puts it more on the social side. There are some social and economic solutions to some of these things. And the interactions with other animals, I mean, that's a long-term struggle, as you know, in various parts of the world. And my experience is it doesn't work to lecture other people. It's like, you look at, I gave you the history of African swine fever there, which goes back to rinderpest, which goes back to colonial invasion of Africa. I mean, it's not a matter of casting blame. It's a matter of saying there's a long history here of problems that are emerging now that are the result of, essentially Europeans going in and solving other people's problems. I think the collaboration I talked about across disciplines, it's across cultures, sitting down with people, listening, what are they doing where they are, how can they improve their situation, and demonstrating something sometimes. It's, if you interact with dogs this way, it's actually, everybody improves.
Yeah, we really see that consistent comment that we see that, well, we've learned from our lessons, why can't you just learn what, we've learned that this doesn't really work and that there's long-term effect of it. So even though we brought that cattle to you, actually it's not so great, or it may lead to problems with your pastures, etc. So it's very difficult. And I think we see that within our own country when we're working.
I think one of the issues that comes up, and I look at it in the chat as well, is the notion that it's either this or that. And it's rarely this or that. It's like the origins of this virus. It's not this or that. There are a lot of different things going on, and improving the ecology. I'm really glad there are people who are looking specifically at preserving habitats and aquatic systems and plastics in the ocean. people need to look at that, and we need to solve those problems. And at the same time, we need to, I'm not an expert in that, right? So I'm looking at other ways of coming at it, and we pay attention to what we're doing. And in the human health, they're looking at, people pushing plastic so it doesn't spread the virus, and then other people going, there's no evidence that it actually does that. In fact, it makes it worse. We're making a bad situation worse by generating more plastic. What are some other solutions here? And looking at those kinds of dynamics.
Very complex.
I've been asked to write, sign letters and so on, and I'm always a little bit wary. There are some things that I think we can all agree on, the shutting down as much as we can, or restricting, or at least regulating wildlife trade or fresh markets. If you say, oh, they have to shut down the fresh markets in China, does that mean we have to shut down all the farmers markets in Canada? The Ottawa Byward market and the Toronto market and those kind of things. That's, regulation and more education about, these kind of things. I can see that, but we start imposing rules on everybody that are important in a certain place. I'm not sure that that's going to help us in the long run.
Yes, and I think we as the CVMA, we're very supportive of our production animal veterinarians, and to look at how some of these trends are changing the face of food in Canada, worldwide, but specifically in Canada. And I think also to see that, this focus, and as we've seen some of our people asking questions on moving away from different forms of protein, how that will change. And I think even with the pandemic, what we've seen is that maybe the way that things are running right now isn't always going to work for us. When we had slaughter, large facilities being shut down because of the pandemic, it put a complete halt on our food production, and that escalated to people on farms being affected with cows that they could not cull, who needed to be culled, et cetera. And then we talk about small farm, being able to buy local foods, and yet we still need to have safe environments for that food to be produced, right? So it's complex. I'll take that one last little question, which just, we must take the eco as in economy out of the ecosystem so that income comes second to survival of the planet and therefore people. True to point, but
it is true, and if it depends where you are, right? I mean, I think that's a very important point across the board. Income comes second. Anybody that's studied the social determinants of health will tell you, well, it's some sort of income is important, and so that's where things like maybe a guaranteed income come in, where it's not. Income isn't tied to extractive resources or industrial development. It's tied to social networks. It's tied to people caring about each other. And so then our well-being, our health is improved. And it's not tied to being able to produce more and generate more money. It's being able to spread the money around more equitably.
Thank you. So I think that's pretty much most of the questions that we've had so far. So I will take just a second to again thank our Program Plus sponsors. We've got IDEX and Merck, as well as our program sponsors, PetCard, PetSecure, and Virbac. And also to take a moment to let you know that we will be having this recorded webinar for your viewing as members after this as well. So if you know somebody that really would find this interesting, you can certainly, if they are members of the CVMA, forward this along to them. I would like to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to Dr. David Waltner-Toews for this incredible presentation. It really did knock off our Animal Health Week well. We didn't know coming into this Animal Health Week, when it was decided upon over a year ago, that we'd be in the middle of a pandemic. So our choice of it being about zoonosis ended up being quite to the point, let's say. So on that note, there's a lot of thanks coming in the chat box. Thank you very, very much. I hope everyone has a wonderful Animal Health Week, and stay tuned for more of our town halls, Take Fives that are coming up. And to remember also, we're coming up also with our month of supporting of registered veterinary technicians in Canada. Okay?
Okay.
Signing out, everybody. Thank you so much.